she moved like the shadows. The words left Captain James Winter's mouth before he realized he'd spoken them. Minutes earlier, Helmand Province had erupted in dust and concussion. SEALs and British forces pushed toward a fortified compound. Breach charges primed, sectors assigned, ISR overhead. Then, the assault fractured. An internal detonation. Comms drowned in static. Visibility collapsed to a choking haze. A secondary threat surfaced inside the structure. A British operator went down, trapped, bleeding, cut off from the stack. Christine Tunner didn't argue, didn't signal for attention. She disappeared into the breach. No wasted movement, controlled pairs, corners cleared with surgical precision. Heat signatures reduced to silence. She found the wounded operator and neutralized the threat before the perimeter could reorganize. When she emerged through the dust, carrying him, Winter could only stare. And in that moment, command meant something different. What happened inside that compound would rewrite more than a mission report. It would test doctrine, ego, and the meaning of command under fire. Stay with this story, because in Helmand, the real battle wasn't just against the enemy. It was against everything they thought they understood about power.
The air in Helmand Province was thick with copper tongue and dry, pulverized earth, a scent that clung to lungs and coated the tongue. High-resolution thermal scopes flickered on the command tent's rigged monitors, displaying the jagged terrain with clinical precision. U.S. Navy SEALs checked their sidearms and rifle optics, adjusting eye relief and zeroing in on the compound perimeter. British paratroopers synchronized watches, confirmed CUM frequencies, and ran silent checks on explosive ordnance equipment. Every movement was deliberate, a practiced choreography of precision under the looming threat of an unseen enemy. Captain James Winter adjusted his beret, the crisp tilt failing to mask the crease forming between his brows. His gaze lingered on Christine Tunner as she methodically tested the tension on her suppressed MCX rattler, fingers tracing the charging handle with quiet efficiency. Winter's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He spoke of dominance, projecting a brittle confidence in the need for raw aggression. His voice carried authority, each word designed to assert control over both men and space. Christine's measured silence, the deliberate absence of verbal confirmation, was a refusal to participate in his theater. Her eyes scanned the compound, evaluating angles of cover, potential IED placements, and egress routes. Not a flicker of doubt passed over her features. The assault began under a moonless sky. Breach charges detonated in calculated sequences, the concussive bursts rattling the tent frames and scattering dust like a prelude to chaos. Within minutes, a secondary IED tore through the eastern wall, severing the British advance element from their support. Communications dissolved into static and fragmented calls, urgency layering over panic as voices competed across open frequencies. In the center of the kill zone, a British operator lay pinned beneath a fragmenting wall, his breathing shallow, helmet askew, eyes wide with immediate shock. Winter barked commands into a dead radio, the red glare of reflected monitors flashing across his flushed face. His hands, poised for action, tightened into fists. He didn't notice Christine move. She didn't call her position or seek affirmation. Her body transitioned from perimeter to shadow, moving along the fractured geometry of the ruined compound with the fluidity of a trained predator. Dust swirled around her boots, each step calculated to avoid displacing debris that might betray her trajectory. Inside the structure, she engaged the insurgent machine gun nest in 3 precise bursts, suppressor muting the report. Each shot was deliberate, eliminating the threat before the occupants registered a breach. She assessed the pinned operator, hands steady, rolling him onto a stable flank, positioning his spine against a solid column for cover. Her breathing remained measured, every exhale controlled, as the roof groaned ominously above. Debris threatened the structure, but her assessment of load distribution dictated every movement she was calculating. collapse vectors as naturally as she moved. When the dust finally settled, the extraction helicopters circling overhead cut shadows across the compound's desolation. Christine emerged from the settling silt, her uniform immaculate except for the blood of the man she had saved. Winter's eyes followed her approach, disbelief etched into every line of his face. His mouth opened to speak, but no sound came. The words of his earlier dismissal caught in his throat. The desert wind carried them away, leaving only a whisper, barely audible. She moved like the shadows. He studied her for the first time not as an anomaly, but as an operative whose skill exceeded every assumption he had ever made. She stood, rifle slung, observing the cleared perimeter, the faintest indication of exhaustion hidden behind practiced composure. Her eyes scanned the remaining sector, calculating exit points, safe zones, and potential residual threats. There was no pride in her posture, only the calm authority of a professional who had navigated chaos without hesitation. The night air settled over the compound. Broken masonry glimmered under the starlight, dust and smoke coiling in the low gravity of chaos. Winter remained frozen in place, the gravity of Christine's movements silent, deliberate, lethal pressing upon his perception of command. He adjusted his beret again, but it offered no shield from the realization. Dominance was irrelevant in the presence of precision. The forward operating base was quiet in the aftermath, though silence carried weight heavier than any gunfire. The sand-strewn compound smelled faintly of spent brass and diesel. Inside the debriefing room, fluorescent lights cast a stark glare over the maps spread across the table. Each contour line a record of terrain and threat. Captain James Winters sat with his fingers tapping a rigid rhythm against the laminated topography. His pen hovered over the section of the mission report marked unauthorized entry. His shoulders were squared, but subtle signs betrayed the friction under his skin, a microtic in his left eye, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, a shallow exhale held just long enough to suggest restraint rather than ease. Christine Tunner sat across from him, rifle optics disassembled on the table in front of her, cleaning cloths and precision brushes methodically arranged. Her hands moved in exact, deliberate motions, a silent cadence matching the slow, controlled rise and fall of her chest. She observed Winter without blinking, noting the tremor in his fingers as a paratrooper offered gratitude for the rescue. His hand, clenched at the report, flickered briefly in imperceptible tension. His mouth remained a line. There was no smile, no acknowledgement beyond the harsh edge of reprimand. "Risk," he said, voice flat but sharp enough to cut across the room. "A fluke. Pure luck." Each syllable was measured, intended to undermine. He looked at the Joint Command officers present, their notebooks open, pens poised, all waiting for the rebuttal Christine would not offer. She didn't flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on the lens of a scope, polishing each element with meticulous care. The optic glass caught the overhead light, reflecting small controlled glints. Her observation was quiet but thorough. Winter's movements betrayed the thought process of a man dependent on tradition over adaptability. A pause here, a finger tracing a line on the map there, delay in decision-making visible in the way his pen hovered longer than necessary. She noted his reliance on maps of the green zone, unchanged from prior months, disregarding the shifted irrigation trenches that insurgents had been exploiting for movement. Her notebook recorded patterns with the precision of a forensic analyst, documenting every deviation, every hesitation, every procedural oversight. The SEAL team remained silent. Eyes followed Winter's posture, his sharp hand gestures, the way he inhaled through clenched teeth when the paratrooper repeated thanks. They recognized Christine's reputation, her clinical efficiency under pressure, and they also understood the precarious balance of joint operations politics. Winter's dominance was a constant, but the subtle erosion caused by his cruelty was becoming apparent in the reactions of those around him. When Winter dismissed the briefing, the motion was sharp, a flick of the wrist designed to erase attention, to regain the illusion of authority. Christine continued her work, unflinching, cataloging discrepancies and behaviors, every subtle tremor and misalignment logged with clinical detachment. She was no longer just another operative in the room. Her presence had shifted the equilibrium. She was an auditor of command, quietly assessing, silently evaluating. Every observation a calculated step toward ensuring accountability without drawing unnecessary attention. The room emptied, leaving Winter seated momentarily in the glow of the map lights, hands clasped in front of him, the tension of the failed mission still pressing against his spine. Christine collected her optics, each piece replaced with precise alignment, then stood. Her eyes met no one's, but the subtext of competence, control, and imperceptible authority lingered in the air she left behind. Winter remained, unaware that in the silent aftermath, the ledger of command had already begun to balance against him. A week into the joint deployment, the Tactical Operations Center hummed with subdued activity, the low glow of monitors casting harsh shadows across maps and intelligence packets. Winter assumed command of the planning session with an ease born of repetition. His voice returned to its familiar cadence, booming, deliberate, a tonal assertion that projected control. He outlined a hammer and anvil maneuver down the main transit corridor, vehicles advancing in a linear push, supported by Overwatch teams on the flanks designed to force insurgents into a kill zone. Every movement of his hands traced familiar vectors, lines of attack he had rehearsed hundreds of times in previous deployments, medals lining the unspoken record of success. Christine Tunner sat near the back of the room, stylus poised over the digital tablet displaying the satellite imagery. Her eyes scanned every contour, every anomaly, measuring angles and shadowing with precision. Freshly dug trenches cut diagonally across what Winter had identified as the assault path. The micropatterns suggested a baited entry, deliberately engineered to funnel friendly forces into a compromised zone. Her pulse remained steady, breath controlled, shoulders squared. But her grip on the stylus tightened just enough to whiten her knuckles. She raised a hand, not to challenge, but to point, index finger tracing the pattern on the tablet. Winter's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing slightly, nostrils flaring imperceptibly. "Captain Tunner," he said, tone-cutting, rank used as an instrument of dismissal rather than acknowledgement. "I've been conducting operations in this theater since you were in primary school. We don't need subtlety when we have superior firepower." His lips compressed, a faint twitch in the left corner betraying a simmering frustration barely masked by controlled cadence. The room's atmosphere shifted. Pens hovered over notebooks, junior officers' eyes flicking from map to map, following lines and vectors, sensing the unspoken friction. The slight elevation of Winter's chin, the sharp exhale he barely contained. Each gesture radiated authority, but also a brittle overcompensation. Christine did not flinch. Not a muscle in her face moved. Her gaze, fixed on the tablet, registered every fold of the terrain, every potential threat vector. The stylus traced a margin line, deliberate, subtle, as though she were not merely recording mission parameters, but cataloging behavioral metrics. Each gesture mapped Winter's decision-making blind spots. The slight hesitations when terrain variables shifted, the dependence on precedent over analysis. That night, while the base slept under a crescent moon, the Tactical Operations Center remained illuminated by the cold glow of monitors. Christine cross-referenced Winter's prior 3 deployments, running geospatial overlays against mission logs and redacted after-action reports. Patterns emerged: an overextended flank here, a delayed call for extraction there, a repeated reliance on overwhelming force to compensate for incomplete intelligence. Casualties and near misses were footnotes in reports sanitized for command review. Yet they traced the same structural flaw: Winter's ego-driven insistence on a strong front at all costs. Christine observed the logs with the same detachment she applied in field operations. Every variable logged, every procedural lapse noted with methodical precision. The faint crease at the corner of her eye, the subtle shift in her posture, and the controlled cadence of her breathing betrayed no emotion, yet reflected the intense mental focus required to process layers of operational risk. Winter, she realized, was not merely arrogant. He was a danger compounded by authority. The patterns indicated that his next mission, particularly one involving the Gerishks district, would stress the limits of his judgment and place the entire joint element at exposure. As monitors refreshed and satellite imagery cycled through thermal overlays, Christine methodically logged coordinates, breach options, overwatch positions, and potential ambush vectors. Each annotation was precise, measured, intended not for immediate confrontation, but for a comprehensive understanding of command deficiencies. Winter's ego, previously an inert variable, now became a critical factor in operational calculus. She closed the final overlay, stylus lifted, posture straight, eyes scanning the room one last time. The tactical center was silent, save for the soft hum of equipment. Outside, the base slept, unaware that the quiet observer within had already delineated the parameters of the next engagement, and the exact points where leadership could fail. The Gerishk mission commenced under a sky dense with ochre clouds, the horizon a muted prelude to the approaching sandstorm. Dust hung low, stirred by gusts that bent the sparse vegetation and scoured loose sand across hardened soil. Winter led the assault with the familiar cadence of force. Armored Land Rovers roared down the narrow urban corridor, their heavy machine guns staccato against shadowed alleys. Every barrel flash highlighted the angular facades of mud brick buildings, their walls pocked from prior firefights. For the first 20 minutes, the operation seemed to obey Winter's command. Insurgent positions yielded in apparent disorder, the force advancing deeper into the labyrinthine urban sprawl of the district. Christine, perched on an overwatch rooftop with an unobstructed view of the corridor, adjusted her thermal optics with deliberate precision. She scanned each heat signature against prior intelligence overlays. The patterns contradicted the narrative of retreat. Insurgent movement was synchronized, structured, not fleeing. Her pulse remained steady. Yet a micro-twitch at the corner of her eye and the subtle rise of her shoulders betrayed the recognition of a calculated trap. Heat signatures emerged in the ruins behind the advancing column, not receding but expanding, an invisible compression funneling them toward a kill zone. She keyed her radio with practiced cadence, voice calm yet cutting through the cacophony of engine roar and gunfire. "Winter, this is Tunner. Sector 4 is closing. We are losing our egress. Break contact now." Winter's reply came harsh, clipped, and elevated over the drone of engines. "Stay in your lane, Tunner. We have them on the run. Forward." His jaw clenched visibly, a slight tremor at the corner of his left eye betraying the friction between ego and emerging awareness. He pressed onward, chasing the semblance of decisive action. Blinded by the dominance he preached, unaware that the operational variables had shifted beneath his command. Seconds later, a detonator's click echoed an almost imperceptible precursor. Then, the corridor erupted in fire and kinetic energy. The lead and rear vehicles of Winter's column were obliterated, trapped between walls and fire. The Alley of Tears, so named for prior engagements, lived up to its reputation. Flame and smoke coiled, visibility dropped to zero, and the British paratroopers were pinned behind the twisted hulks of their own transport. The heat from engines and munitions reflected off the mud walls, illuminating the frantic gestures of soldiers attempting to regain situational awareness. Winter dismounted, pressing his shoulder against a crumbling wall, eyes wide, scanning for any semblance of control. His breath was shallow, fists flexing at his sides, fingers brushing against the safety of his sidearm before pulling back instinctively. He had achieved the aggression he sought, but in the absence of coordination, his presence counted for nothing against the methodical trap orchestrated by unseen adversaries. From her elevated position, Christine assessed the unfolding scenario with methodical detachment. The micro-adjustments of her weapon's reticle, the regulated cadence of her exhalations, and the slight flex of her wrist as she transitioned to semi-auto were imperceptible to anyone below. Each insurgent silhouette that entered the kill zone was neutralized with controlled, precise fire. There was no flash, no spectacle, only the efficacy of applied skill. She accounted for trajectory, cover displacement, and collateral obstacles simultaneously, each engagement calibrated to maintain the integrity of the trapped friendly element. Her communication remained minimal but exact. Subtle shifts in insurgent positions were conveyed through rapid, clipped transmissions. The column's egress points were recalculated in real time, overlaid with intelligence from overhead drones. Every movement was measured, every order calibrated against terrain, enemy disposition, and Winter's compromised command posture. She did not hesitate. She did not hesitate to assert authority through action. The Alley of Tears, once a funnel of destruction, became a corridor of calculated extraction under her guidance. Winter remained pressed against the mud wall, his aggression muted by the unfolding variables he had failed to account for. Christine's presence, quiet and lethal, filled the operational gap, ensuring the survival of the unit without a single lapse. The sandstorm on the horizon crept closer, but the extraction sequence proceeded unbroken, a testament to methodical observation and disciplined execution rather than the thunderous assertion Winter had relied upon. Winter's radio erupted with static-laden screams, each channel a fragment of chaos. The sergeant's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a garbled mix of shouts and the echo of gunfire bouncing off narrow alley walls. Winter's fingers fumbled along his belt, seeking the familiar weight of a fragmentation grenade. When he finally grasped it, his hand betrayed him. The pinch of thumb and forefinger trembled violently, the safety pin slipping into the dust before he could recover it. His jaw clenched, lips parting slightly, teeth barely visible as he inhaled shallowly. Shoulders rigid, a man accustomed to command now undone by the immediacy of survival. From her rooftop perch, Christine observed the field with the same discipline that had guided her through decades of operational experience. The rhythmic thud-thud of her suppressed rifle echoed faintly, deliberate, precise. Each pulse of fire found its mark before the insurgents had time to register the intrusion. They dropped in sequence, micro-movements arrested mid-stride, bodies folding into cover with a quiet inevitability. There was no spectacle, no cinematic flash of muzzle smoke, only the absolute efficiency of a controlled operator. Her boots found minimal purchase on fractured tiles, each step calculated to avoid detection. Muscles coiled and released with a predator's cadence. Winters's eyes scanned the chaos through a layer of dust and smoke, catching the occasional glint of copper or the flicker of shadow. He did not see her approach along the rooftops, nor the way she anticipated every angle of fire. Through his headset, a voice finally cut through the fragmented coms. "Winter, move your men through the breach at 2 o'clock. I've cleared the cellar. Go. Now." The clipped phrasing carried authority but no flourish, no need for acknowledgement. Winter's gaze flicked to the breach, a narrow, overlooked hole in the courtyard wall, dismissed earlier as inconsequential. His eyebrows lifted, a micro-expression betraying disbelief. The muscles at his temple twitching as he processed the reality of the situation. He signaled his men with a controlled hand gesture, jaw tight, knuckles pressing white against the metal of his sidearm. Soldiers scrambled through the dust-choked alley, weapons at the ready, scanning the remnants of an ambush they had yet to comprehend. As they passed, the bodies of insurgents, neutralized by Christine's silent precision, marked a path through chaos. Not a single shot beyond those required for tactical suppression had been wasted. Each fallen enemy told the story of a professional who did not announce her presence, who did not rely on spectacle, who let skill, positioning, and timing dictate outcomes rather than volume or ego. The extraction point loomed ahead, partially obscured by the rising sandstorm. The orange haze rolled across rooftops and debris, swallowing the battlefield in a blinding curtain. The convoy moved through it without hesitation, each operator adjusting to the reduced visibility with practiced efficiency. Winter remained on the edge of the column, chest rising and falling with controlled, forced rhythm. Boots scuffing unevenly across gravel as his mind raced to process a scenario beyond his planned aggression. When the unit returned to the fob, the atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. The bravado of command had eroded, leaving only the weight of survival and professional respect. British paratroopers looked at Christine with quiet intensity, eyes tracking the precise alignment of her movements, noting the calm that had guided them through an otherwise fatal ambush. Winter, however, did not meet her gaze. His boots thudded against the metal grating of the tarmac as he walked to his quarters, shoulders slumped, the tension in his spine unmoving, the tremor in his hand faint but persistent. He understood, deep within the marrow of his experience, that the helmet cam footage recorded everything, the decisions he had failed to make, the precise intervention that had saved the unit. His career, once seemingly invincible, rested on the mercy of circumstance. Christine, however, did not upload the footage. She stored it with methodical discretion, eyes calm, body relaxed, as if waiting for the exact moment when it would be needed to correct the ledger, not to punish. She carried the quiet authority of a professional whose control did not demand recognition, whose actions spoke louder than any words could. In the days following Garrisk, Winter's methods shifted from battlefield command to administrative control. Orders came down with clipped precision, routed through official channels but carrying the unmistakable imprint of personal intent. Christine Tunner was reassigned to equipment inventory, maintenance audits, and base-level logistical verification duties technically within her authority, yet strategically chosen to isolate. The memorandum bore Winter's digital signature, clean and lawful on its surface. During morning briefings, Winter spoke of American interference with a faint tightening at the corner of his mouth. His jaw flexed when referencing the Alley of Tears, his narrative reshaped into one of calculated aggression nearly victorious, saved only by timing and fortune. He described luck with a dismissive exhale, fingers drumming once against the table before stilling. Officers around him maintained professional posture, though glances were exchanged and quickly withdrawn. No one challenged the account. No one affirmed it either. Christine reported to the inventory office without comment. The room smelled of paper, oil, and cold electronics. Steel shelving units lined the walls, stacked with serialized equipment cases, spare optics, encrypted radios awaiting inspection. She logged into the central logistics system and began cross-referencing after-action reports with maintenance records. Her movements were methodical, stylus tapping, screens shifting, time stomps aligning under scrutiny. Her breathing remained steady, shoulders relaxed, eyes scanning with the same controlled focus she applied through a rifle scope. The inventory office functioned as a quiet nexus. Shipment manifests, munitions certifications, contractor invoices, and readiness reports converged there before distribution to command. Christine traced maintenance cycles on vehicle platforms assigned to Winter's prior deployments. Missed inspections, deferred part replacements, intelligence summaries flagged but unacknowledged. Each discrepancy was documented without annotation or commentary, catalogued with sterile precision. In the officer's mess, Winter poured gin into a short glass, the liquid catching light as his hand hovered a fraction too long before setting the bottle down. His laughter carried across the room, sharp, brittle, whenever Garish surfaced in conversation. Yet, when left alone, his fingers rubbed absently at the inside of his wrist, pulse measured under skin as if confirming something remained steady. Back in the inventory office, Christine accessed a munitions report from the previous month. A shipment of thermal batteries had been classified as defective and written off. The contractor notation cited quality control failure. She overlaid the shipment codes with distribution logs from adjacent sectors. The serial numbers matched items later flagged in black market seizure reports. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise, but in confirmation. The approval signature authorizing disposal carried Winter's encrypted key. She did not react outwardly. Instead, she downloaded the relevant documentation, preserving chain of custody metadata, digital timestamps, authorization trails, contractor correspondence. Each file was stored within a secure folder, encrypted to military-grade protocol. The dossier expanded beyond tactical misjudgment into documented irregularity. One afternoon, Winter entered the inventory room without announcement. The door struck the stopper with a dull thud. Christine did not look up immediately. Her stylus completed a final notation before she raised her gaze. Winter leaned over the desk, breath faintly laced with alcohol. A sneer formed, shallow but deliberate. "Still playing with your little reports, Tunner? You're a glorified clerk now. Accept it." His hand pressed flat against the desk surface, fingers splayed, knuckles pale from pressure. A faint tick flickered beneath his left eye. He searched her face for irritation, defiance, anything he could classify as insubordination. Christine met his stare evenly. No blink, no shift in posture. "I'm just ensuring the record is accurate, Captain, for the sake of the men." Her tone was neutral, devoid of accusation. Winter laughed, a coarse exhale that echoed against the metal shelving. He straightened his beret reflexively, then turned and exited, boots striking the concrete floor in rigid cadence. Christine watched the door close before returning her attention to the tablet. The encryption protocol finalized with a soft confirmation tone. Within the secured archive lay a structured account of missed maintenance cycles, ignored intelligence advisories, and a munitions discrepancy that crossed from negligence into criminal liability. She powered down the screen, hands resting briefly on the desk. Outside, the base moved through its routines, unaware that the administrative record, clean, precise, admissible, now held a quiet counterweight to authority. The deployment was in its terminal phase. Aircraft manifests already circulating through brigade headquarters, equipment slated for retrograde. One operation remained on the schedule: a diplomatic engagement between local tribal elders and a NATO delegation. The selected compound lay in a narrow valley with fractured lines of loyalty, an area where ceasefires held only as long as they were useful. Captain Winter insisted on commanding the security element. He presented his operational concept as a demonstration of dominance. 2 armored convoys would approach from the western ridge, dismounting infantry to establish a 360-degree perimeter. Sniper teams would occupy elevated structures. Rules of engagement would authorize immediate suppression within a 500-meter radius of the compound. The language in his draft was saturated with terms like area denial and overwhelming force. The final briefing convened inside the high-security vault, a reinforced chamber shielded from electronic surveillance. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile glare over the digital terrain model projected on the central screen. General Vance presided at the head of the table, hands folded, expression composed. Winter stood beside the projection, laser pointers steady against the topographic overlay. His jaw was clean-shaven, uniform pressed to regulation sharpness. The red dot traced the ridgeline, We will occupy the high ground and maintain a 360-degree perimeter, he stated. Any movement within 500 meters will be met with overwhelming force. We show them we are the masters of this valley. A faint tick pulsed near his left eye as he paused, daring contradiction. His shoulders were squared beyond comfort, chest lifted as if bracing against unseen recoil. General Vance inclined his head once, neither endorsement nor dismissal. His gaze shifted past Winter, scanning the seated officers. It stopped on Christine in the third row. "Captain Tunner," the general said evenly, "you've been quiet this entire deployment. You were on the ground in the Gerishk incident. What's your take on the valley?" Air seemed to compress in the room. Winter's knuckles tightened around the laser pointer. A flush crept up his collar, spreading across his cheekbones. He turned his head toward Christine, not fully, just enough for one eye to fix on her. The muscle in his jaw flexed. Christine rose without haste. Her chair legs made a muted scrape against the concrete floor. She kept her hands relaxed at her sides. She did not look at Winter. She addressed the general directly. "The captain's plan assumes the threat is external, sir," she began. Her voice was level, each word articulated with clinical precision. "However, ISR feeds from the last 48 hours indicate anomalous thermal signatures within the compound itself. Specifically, sustained heat patterns consistent with heavy equipment staged below grade level." She stepped toward the projection screen, requesting no permission, only extending a hand toward the controls. The satellite overlays shifted to infrared imagery. Clusters of heat blooms pulsed beneath the structure's footprint. "The local security partners reported no construction activity," she continued. "Yet the thermal mass suggests reinforced emplacement in the cellar. If this were a standard Shura, there would be no requirement for that configuration." Winter inhaled sharply through his nose. The sound was thin but audible. Christine's eyes remained on the data. A high-visibility armored approach would compress our maneuver space and create predictable ingress routes. If the cellar contains pre-positioned ordnance, possibly command-detonated, we would be channelized into a kill zone. The threat axis is not the valley perimeter. It is internal. Silence followed, heavy and procedural. General Vance leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. His gaze shifted between the infrared display and Winter. No expression betrayed his assessment. Winter cleared his throat. "Speculation," he said, though the word lacked force. A bead of perspiration traced from his temple toward his ear. "Thermal anomalies can result from livestock or generator activity." Christine met the general's eyes again. "Livestock do not maintain consistent heat signatures in geometric alignment, sir. Nor do they correspond to reinforced load-bearing points on the original blueprints." The vault's ventilation system hummed overhead. No one moved. Winter's posture remained upright, but the laser pointer in his hand had dipped, its red dot trembling against the map. He did not look at the screen now. He looked at the general. General Vance gave a slow nod. "Noted." Christine returned to her seat with the same measured pace. She folded her hands on the table, breathing steady, gaze forward. Winter stood at the front of the room, uniform immaculate, shoulders rigid. The map still glowed behind him, but the room's attention no longer followed the red dot. Winter released a short, brittle laugh. It echoed against the reinforced concrete walls of the vault, hollow and sharp. "Thermal signatures?" he said, the corner of his mouth lifting without warmth. "You're seeing ghosts, Tunner. The tribal leaders have been vetted. This is exactly what I mean about subtlety. It breeds paranoia." He shifted his weight toward General Vance, angling his body as if Christine were no longer part of the room. "She's been spending too much time in the inventory room, sir." Perhaps the stress of the Gerishk ambush was too much for her nerves. The remark hung in the air, precise in its intent. Christine did not blink. Her breathing remained even, shoulders still beneath the fabric of her uniform. If the words struck, the impact did not register on her face. She lowered her gaze to the tablet in her hand and tapped a sequence of commands. The central display flickered. The topographic map dissolved, replaced by a split-screen feed. On the left, drone footage stamped with time code and GPS coordinates from Gereshk. The camera angle was high, clinical. A figure in a captain's insignia lay prone in the dirt. The image slowed. A gloved hand fumbled at a fragmentation grenade. The pin slipped from rigid fingers and disappeared into the dust. On the right, a procurement ledger extracted from the logistics server. Digital signatures authenticated by cryptographic key. Line items for thermal batteries designated defective. Transfer confirmations routed through a civilian contractor. The authorization field bore Winter's encrypted credential. The vault fell silent. The hum of the ventilation system became distinct, mechanical, and steady. Beneath it, another rhythm, faster, uneven. Winter's pulse pressed visibly at the base of his throat. A sheen of perspiration gathered along his hairline. His hand, still holding the laser pointer, trembled once before he lowered it to his side. General Vance did not speak immediately. His eyes moved from the footage to the ledger, then to Winter. The muscles in his jaw tightened, a subtle shift beneath composed authority. "Captain Winter," the general said at last, his voice descending into a controlled, deliberate register, "care to explain why naval special warfare assets possess more comprehensive intelligence on your logistics chain than you do?" Winter opened his mouth. No sound emerged. His tongue passed briefly over dry lips. He tried again. "The footage context matters," he managed, though the sentence fractured midway. His gaze darted to the screen and away again, as if proximity might confirm its authenticity. "As for the batteries," the contractor reported. "The digital key is yours," General Vance interrupted. No elevation in tone, just fact. Winter's shoulders, once squared in practiced command presence, seemed to narrow. The flush that had colored his face drained unevenly, leaving a pale band along his jaw. For a moment he looked not at the general, nor at Christine, but at the reinforced door of the vault, as if calculating distance. Christine stepped forward, measured, deliberate. She did not look at Winter. Her focus remained on the operational screen, now cycling through thermal overlays of the Valley compound. "The strategy for tomorrow should not involve armored ingress, sir," she said. Her voice carried without strain. A convoy would signal intent and provide fixed targeting vectors. Based on the tunnel schematics beneath the compound, there is a secondary access corridor running east toward the irrigation culvert. She enlarged the schematic. Subterranean lines traced beneath the structure, like veins. "I've mapped the network using prior engineering surveys cross-referenced with current ISR," she continued. "A small unit element can infiltrate through this corridor and extract the delegation before the scheduled assembly. No kinetic escalation. No visible footprint." Winter's fingers curled inward, nails pressing into his palm. He did not interrupt. "We don't need a hammer," Christine concluded, her eyes steady on the general. "We need a shadow." The vault remained still. The footage from Gereshek lingered in the corner of the display, frozen on a single frame. General Vance regarded the screen for several seconds more before shifting his attention to Christine. He gave a single, deliberate nod. Winter stood motionless at the front of the room, the architecture of his authority stripped to its frame. General Vance did not turn toward Winter when he spoke. "Tunner, the floor is yours. Plan the extraction." His tone was level, administrative. Then, without pause, "Winter, hand over your sidearm and report to the Provost Marshal. You are relieved of command pending an investigation into the Gereshk incident and the munitions discrepancies." The words settled with procedural finality. Winter's hand hovered near his holster for a fraction of a second, as if the muscle memory of command required recalibration. A faint tremor ran through his fingers before he disengaged the retention strap. He drew the sidearm slowly, grip first, magazine still seated, chamber undisclosed. His jaw tightened as he presented it butt forward to the nearest military policeman. 2 MPs stepped to his flanks. Their expressions remained impassive, eyes fixed forward. Winter's shoulders, once squared in habitual authority, sloped inward by degrees. The flush had drained from his face entirely now, leaving a gray cast beneath the fluorescent lights. As he was guided toward the vault door, his gaze remained unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond the reinforced steel. The door sealed behind them with a hydraulic hiss. Christine did not watch him leave. She moved to the head of the table, sliding the digital terrain model back onto the main display. Her posture was upright, hands resting lightly on the edge of the console. The room's attention aligned with her without instruction. "For the record," she began, voice steady, "primary objective is extraction of the NATO delegation prior to scheduled assembly. Secondary objective is 0 civilian casualties and 0 kinetic escalation." She zoomed into the eastern sector of the compound. Subsurface schematics appeared, overlaid with thermal data. Infiltration element will stage at grid reference November Echo 214,673. Entry through the irrigation culvert. Structural analysis indicates load-bearing reinforcement along the main tunnel corridor. However, the southern branch shows erosion consistent with seasonal flooding. Limit foot traffic to single-file spacing to mitigate collapse risk. The British paratroopers leaned forward in their seats. The senior NCO's forearms rested on the table, fists loosely closed, eyes fixed on the projection. There was no shifting, no whispered side commentary, only the soft scratch of a pen marking coordinates. Christine continued, "Wind vector at first light will average 6 knots from the northwest. Rotary wing ingress must adjust approach angle to avoid rotor wash signature over the compound. We do not alert observers." She outlined contingency protocols with clinical precision, casualty evacuation routes, communications redundancies, authentication codes for the delegation. She referenced the psychological posture of the tribal leaders' heightened vigilance after recent regional violence, emphasizing controlled entry, minimal visible armament, measured tone. There was no elevation in her voice, no theatrics. Each directive carried the weight of preparation rather than performance. 6 hours later, the eastern horizon began to pale. The Helmand Peaks cut dark silhouettes against a thinning night sky. The operation launched without ceremony. The infiltration element moved through the culvert in disciplined silence. Boots met packed earth with muted pressure. Overhead, extraction birds maintained altitude beyond visual range, holding in a staggered orbit. Inside the compound, the delegation was located and briefed in concise terms. No raised voices, no panic. They were guided into the tunnel system with controlled urgency, footsteps echoing softly against reinforced walls. Above ground, the compound remained still. By the time insurgent observers registered anomalous movement, the delegation was already airborne. The helicopters banked east, rotors slicing through morning light. No muzzle flashes cut the valley. No return fire answered. When the aircraft settled onto the base tarmac, the downdraft swept dust in wide spirals. The ramp lowered with a metallic groan. Christine stepped down first, helmet secured under one arm. A thin line of dirt traced her sleeve. Her breathing was even, pulse steady at her throat. The British paratroopers assembled in a loose formation near the landing zone. The senior NCO stepped forward, boots striking the concrete with deliberate cadence. His expression was composed, but his eyes held a depth that had not been there weeks earlier. He halted at regulation distance. Without a word, he raised his hand in a sharp, precise salute. The gesture cut cleanly through the rotor wash. One by one, the rest of the unit followed. Palms snapped to brows in disciplined unison. No one spoke. The only sound was the fading whine of turbine engines and the distant call to prayer drifting over the perimeter walls. Christine returned the salute, movement exact and unembellished. They were not acknowledging insignia stitched to fabric. They were acknowledging judgment under pressure, restraint in place of spectacle, and the quiet execution of duty. In the final days of the deployment, the forward operating base settled into the procedural rhythm of redeployment. Equipment was palletized, serial numbers cross-checked against manifests, weapons cleared and inspected under fluorescent light. The tension that had once lingered in corridors and briefing rooms no longer clung to the air. Conversations were quieter, direct, unguarded. Christine sat alone in the transit lounge, duffel secured at her boots, carry-on resting upright beside her chair. The distant grind of forklifts loading cargo onto flatbeds echoed through the hangar bay. She held a paperback open in one hand, thumb marking the margin. Her posture was straight but unforced, shoulders relaxed beneath her uniform blouse. Her eyes moved steadily across the page, unhurried. There was no visible triumph in her expression, no private smile, only composure. The official commendation had been routed through Joint Command that morning, signed and authenticated. The language was formal, commendable initiative, operational foresight, decisive leadership under complex conditions. She had read it once, then folded the document along its original crease. Footsteps approached across the polished concrete floor. A junior officer halted a respectful distance from her chair. He held a copy of the commendation in both hands, the paper slightly bent at the edges where his fingers pressed too firmly. "The captain. He's facing a court-martial back in the UK," the officer said, lowering his voice despite the near-empty room. His eyes flickered briefly toward the flight line visible through reinforced glass. "He keeps telling them it was a setup, that you tricked him." Christine did not lift her gaze from the page. A faint shift of her jaw suggested she had heard every word. "He didn't need any help failing," she replied evenly. "He was just waiting for someone to notice." The officer swallowed, nodding once. The paper in his hands rustled softly before he stepped back, leaving her to the quiet hum of the transit lounge. Beyond the windows, a C-17 transport aircraft sat on the tarmac, its wide fuselage open, cargo ramp lowered like an invitation into shadow. Ground crew moved with rehearsed precision, reflective vests flashing in the late afternoon sun. When boarding was called, Christine rose in a single, fluid motion. She slung her bag over her shoulder, adjusted the strap without looking down. As she stepped onto the flight line, the desert wind swept across the base, lifting strands of her hair and carrying the scent of fuel and dust. Her stride remained even. She passed a stretch of concrete near the operations building where, weeks earlier, Winter had stood too close. Voice edged with condescension, telling her that women had no place in the hard world of combat. The memory registered only as a location marker. She did not slow. Her gaze remained forward. Behind her, maintenance crews secured the final pallets. Ahead, the C-17's cavernous interior waited, dim and metallic, webbed with red cargo straps and reinforced seating. At the edge of the hangar, 2 British soldiers stood watching the boarding process. One leaned slightly against a support beam, a helmet tucked beneath his arm. "She's something else, isn't she?" he murmured, eyes tracking her ascent up the ramp. His mate followed her silhouette as it merged with the aircraft's interior darkness. He gave a small nod, lips pressed thin in thought. "Winter was right about one thing," he said quietly. "She moves like the shadows." His gaze remained fixed on the aircraft as the ramp began to rise. But he forgot that the shadows are where the real power stays. The engines ignited in a deep, rolling crescendo. Heat shimmered behind the turbines as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Within the fuselage, Christine secured herself into the webbed seat, hands resting calmly on her knees. The vibration of the engines traveled through the metal frame and into her bones, steady and familiar. As the C-17 lifted from the Afghan soil and climbed into open sky, the base receded beneath a veil of dust and distance. She did not look back. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel